And that's how you work with people in that more of that one-on-one orientation, would you say, or not? Or
I wouldn't like to give the impression that we were saying we worked like the Mahasiddhas worked, as if we were Mahasiddhas or anything. But there's a principle there that any teacher can employ if he or she is authentically interested in the development of an individual. You know, noticing what their qualities are. And in order to do that, you have to spend enough time with a person. I think it probably begins in being able to tease people, and whether people will allow themselves to be teased or not. And it doesn't take much to be able to tell that. Some people just don't respond well, and then we stop, and then it just doesn't happen. We might try again a few years later and see if teasing works.
It's funny, teasing is a way of getting close to someone, isn't it? And also finding out how much awareness they've got of their own foibles.
Yeah.
You use that as a to test the ground for working with someone in a way.
Yes. I mean, I think there are two kinds of teasing. There is teasing that's unkind and deliberately designed to get one over on somebody.
It's not the sort that would belittle somebody.
No. I mean, British men like to tease each other, and it's deeply unpleasant. It's not what we do. We sort of more... you can tease somebody about their qualities also, you know, that... there's just a way of showing that you understand something about a person, that they're appreciated. And that comes across. But if somebody has got an idea of themselves that they wish to project, then you can't tease them, because they're putting that, they're saying, here I am, this is what you're looking at, you know, and you have to take that away. And if they've got the screen up, there's not much you can do with that. So
well, that blocks out all self-awareness, the screen.
It seems that developing that ability to appreciate the nuances of the people is linked to your use of appreciation in terms of compassion also. That they would come hand in hand perhaps.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Appreciation is like it's almost like touching something. Only I don't mean touching, but it's perceptual touching, isn't it? So you're getting to know or to see something that you couldn't see without appreciation.
What do you think obscures, typically, that ability to touch through perception like that?
Well, it's usually something to do with my own self-referencing, or the commentating that's going on constantly in the background that's getting in the way of me actually seeing something and hearing something. Seeing things as they are, it's always to do with me and my big project. So I'm getting in the way.
And does this lead in at all to the idea of Vajra Romance?
Appreciation is fundamental in terms of having a good relationship. And a good relationship starts with courtship behaviour, where you're getting to know someone. That's what courtship is, isn't it? It's that period of time before you're sure of what the other person's feeling. And so you don't really know whether this relationship is on or not. But in terms of the Vajra Romance, we talk about the gyam of reflection, this is the gyam of falling in love, and that really is based on each partner's appreciation, or each aspect of the couple's appreciation for each other. So it's getting that connection.
If there's someone someone who you've known for a while, and you've been aware of their appearance, either crooked teeth, a broken nose, or one eye is larger than the other, or they're wide apart, or they look peculiar in some way, Now, the interesting thing is that if by some accident you fall in love with that person, then all those things become attractive. This is not some revolutionary idea. I think most people will have been aware of this. And because sometime after they fall out of love and they're with a new partner, they look back at that person and think, oh God, it's all come back again, those crooked teeth. I don't like those. But you liked them for that period. And it's that liking, that appreciation that gets sparked that is really interesting, that is similar in some ways to the Telecaster. I didn't like the look of it until I understood it. I thought, this is Art Deco, and suddenly the whole thing made sense to me. It's like the tricone, that I never really liked the grill work on it. I'll hook it down. Well, I'll hook it up, actually. I like the sound of the thing, but I never liked the fact that it had this basket work on it. I thought basket work does not belong on a guitar. I didn't like the fact that there was a triangle set like that in the middle of it, until I realized that it's the Chrysler building. This is just a small Chrysler building, and it's Art Deco. And I thought, now I understand it. Only in Art Deco would you do something like this. And then it was understood. It's kind of remarkable. It's not that there always has to be an understanding you can explain. I'm making it sound as if that's important, but it's actually not. That when you come to like a thing, you just like it.
That's the same in romance.
Yes.
You can't explain why you fall in love with someone. That's a mystery.
I think there's a suspicion about falling in love, that it's a sort of a kind of being gripped with a mixture of intoxication and projection, and that when one emerges from the so-called honeymoon period, and you think, who is this person? I don't actually like you, without the hormonal cocktail of the infatuation. How is what you're describing, the falling in love of the Vajra Romance, that phase, different from that description of it?
Well, there are two things that happen more or less simultaneously. What happens as described in the books, I can almost quote the first one I saw, with which I was horrified, that love is a relatively harmless pathology which, when it's exhausted, the real work of the relationship starts. I read this in a bookshop in Walnut Grove, California, about to give a talk, and they put me next to a trolley with new books on it, and it happened to be a romance that was on at the moment. I leafed through them, and they more or less all said this. And that's when we decided that we would start teaching on Khandro Pao Nida Melongu, because we thought this can't be the only information out there for people. This is depressing material. Not that it's wrong, but it's only part of the story. It's also true that we're attracted to each other by virtue of having similar neuroses, similar dysfunctional families. We're not saying this is not true. That is there. But there's also something else that happens at the same time, and that is the nyam of Khandro Pao reflection. And those things are independent. Both happen. Usually what they describe in the books is what dominates, unless you prioritize courtship behavior. If you prioritize courtship behavior, you actually have to practice Buddhism. You have to be kind and open. You can't be unpleasant and closed-minded. That's not going to attract anybody or keep anybody, so you're obliged to keep up that practice. If you decide simply to keep it up, it's endless. And of course, if you're both working at it equally, then you're inspired to your best behavior. So the whole thing starts working, and you start discovering more and more that is actually admirable about the other person, and you start to appreciate the way that they are actually inciting your better behavior, and that when you act in ways that are not so wonderful, you don't feel good about it, and you're apt to apologize for it and correct your behavior. So it can go in one of two directions. If you're not able to enter into that, then of course you go the way that, then you're into arbitration. I'll do this if you do that. Then it's all gone. But there is this nyam that Khandro Déchen was mentioning. This is something that exists in another aspect of being that's got nothing to do with conditioning. So it erupts out from behind the screen of conditioning. And if you latch into that, it gets too involved here to explain it. I mean, there's a book about that thick we've written on it. We're having to finger paint here. But, in terms of explaining how that happens is really quite technical. The practice is quite simple, but its background or its underpinning is extremely complex. But it deals with the Tsalung system. It deals with that subtle level of energy and a nyam called Tralame, which is a particular kind of energy that one has more of it when one's young, which is why falling in love with the first time is always highly explosive, because the Tralame has not become distorted. But one can't rely on that energy in terms of facilitating a relationship that is a practice. You're through entering into that experience of Tralame and cooperating with it. Because all practice is cooperating with non-dual reality. That's what Shine is, that's what Latong is. It's a form of cooperating with what naturally occurs.
What you mentioned there, to prioritize practice of courtship or courtship behaviour.
Yes.
Over what? And how would you define courtship behaviour?
Kindness and openness.
And you would be prioritising it over the neurotic aspect, over the me project. That becomes slightly more ephemeral in the background if one prioritises courtship behaviour, because you're being open, so you're saying yes to your partner, yeah, I'll do that. And you're also being kind, you're doing spontaneous, kindly actions. I'll go and get him a bunch of flowers, or whatever his bunch of flowers is. So those are the two aspects of Buddhist practice. Openness being wisdom and kindness being compassion. And that's entered into entirely by the accident of romance. Falling in love actually makes you do that naturally without even having to think about it, which is that's quite amazing, really. I mean, we do have spontaneous kindness, of course we have. Everything that makes you smile, everything that makes you want to do something for someone spontaneously is one's non-dual nature sparkling through. But this is, when it happens in a couple and you're both doing it, then it kind of becomes slightly more like a fire burning, something catching fire in terms of its energy.
It also challenges, it tends to break patterns too. A story. This has never happened to me yet, I'm glad to say, but one's in this romantic situation. You're sitting there after the nice meal and you're talking, and this wonderful person says to me, "Do you like ABBA?" And I say, being the diplomat that I am, I've never really listened to them that much. And then she says, I've got all their albums. Would you like to hear one? And I say, yeah, all right then. And she puts it on, and I start listening, and I say, you know, I've never really listened to them this way before, and of course I haven't. And I start hearing things that are not entirely unpleasant. I say, fortunately, this has never happened to me, because I'm just choosing the most horrendous scenario I can think of. Actually, the Bee Gees could be slightly worse, but... So it breaks those patterns. I mean, you know...
And that's broken naturally. It's not that you're being manipulative and saying, I really like ABBA. It's really happening to you, and something magical's happened that you're perceiving in a different way.
What is the difference between riding the momentum of that in a relationship and, in a sense, commodifying the relationship in the me project? What I've seen sometimes is people say they take the relationship as a spiritual practice, but it ends up being a sort of a mutual rejection of each other, a pairing of people who are basically leveraging each other in order to change.
Well, that wouldn't be my definition of being in love with someone, because you'd be entering a relationship with some sort of prior plan, which would be to self-serve. So that's not what we're describing in the nature of romance at all.
What's the difference then between giving somebody their flowers from a place of kindness, aware that it's also a practice, and being nice to somebody, giving them their flowers as a means of leveraging that act for practice?
You only have to really think about the practice of it when you become aware you've not been practicing it for a while.
Yeah, when you've slipped.
But when you're practicing it, you don't have that self-awareness of it. These things occur spontaneously. You know, it's like, you know, in the early stages of a romance, your partner says, I've got to help my aunt move her furniture from Inverness. Do you fancy coming with me on the weekend when you just spent all week at work? And you say, sure, yeah. You know, that's, I must do this as a practice. It doesn't come into it.
It's a bit like if you were practicing silent sitting meditation, and you'd be thinking very rigidly, I've got to keep sitting upright, I have to keep my spine erect, I have to be erect, I have to be erect. That will be the equivalent in formal practice. And actually, you just have to let go and relax and let be. Otherwise, it's just more and more self-referentiality. So it's always me-centred, me bouncing off the world, and it would be like me bouncing into a relationship, and it would still be more me. So you wouldn't be thinking about it like that.
How would one undermine that chronic me-centeredness, whether it's in the silent sitting or in relationship?
I think the whole idea of me or I as a problem is, to a certain extent, Sutrayana based. The emphasis with Sutrayana is to realize the I is not there. There was a certain time when I was teaching and people were very keen on this I business, and somebody said to me, so with this visualization then, who's doing the visualization? And I said, who's asking the question? Who's hearing it? You can't proceed like that, you know. And it made me feel that I'd like to give a teaching. I've never done this yet, but it was called Come Back Ego, All is Forgiven. The non-existence of the Atman is its non-existence as a project. It's not to say there's nothing there, it just doesn't continue. So this I is there every moment, but it's not there in the next and not in the one before. It's just now. And if you try to locate it now, you can't find it anyway. So there's not really such a concern about the me project in terms of Vajrayana, apart from self-obsession, which is also a process. But the whole Vajrayana point of view is a lot more relaxed about this I business. It's not central anymore, because once Vajrayana is based on emptiness. That's the starting point. I think actually that is something that ought to be emphasized a little bit more with the people who are practicing, because if you haven't stabilized Shinhe to a certain extent, I mean, how are you practicing Vajrayana? I mean, you can't be. To practice Vajrayana with no experience of emptiness is meaningless. It's actually pretty much a New Age activity where you're engaging in acts of fantasy. So there has to be emptiness there. And once that experience is there, then the fact that I am here is not such a problem, because I is not such a great big solid thing. So from that, these teachings on Vajra Romance are based on emptiness. So that's the main reason that the me project or the I project is not really a serious question there. It is if you haven't had that experience. But of course, romance itself tends to encourage a certain degree of selflessness. If you want it all to work, you have to put yourself second. And in the romantic situation, that happens quite naturally. Will you do this for me? Sure. It's not a moment's thought there. Will it be inconvenient? Yes, of course it will. But that doesn't matter. Now, of course, it really becomes a practice when it starts to slip. Now, the emptiness that exists, that facilitates the romantic behaviour, the courtship behaviour, is the thought of possible loss. So the first main problem occurs when commitment is established. When there's no fear of loss, where's the emptiness? That has to be found somewhere else in order to continually ignite the practice. Otherwise, it can begin to fall apart at that point. So, of course, the emptiness there is more the practice of being with another person and allowing yourself to be either challenged or threatened by that person. That is not that the person deliberately challenges you or threatens you, but that you have to seek out that challenge or threat from the being of the other. So this is another aspect of the practice, that the Khandro Déchen has different ideas to mine. She wants the Yuletide tree here rather than there. And I think, oh, there, right. What do I do about that? Well, we happen to agree on this position, by the way, but if we hadn't have done, it would have been interesting.
What would have happened then?
We would have listened to each other.
Yeah.
What else could happen?
And what's the loss that's looming there in terms of emptiness in that example?
Loss of where I wanted it.
Yeah, loss of your idea. Oh, I thought we'd have it there.
And so...
That's the only place for it.
So if we have a difference of opinion on something, it's intriguing. Because I immediately know, all right, well, I've got something here that I'd like to do, and the Khandro Déchen has got another idea, and so my idea is under threat here. Well, right then. So we tend to look for what's preferable about each other's option rather than going for our own.
But the thing is, though, if you're in this sort of relationship where you know your partner is really considering seriously what you want to do, you're actually quite tentative then about the way you need to assert, or the way you would choose to assert your opinion, because you realise that you're in a very powerful place, and you don't want to abuse that. So you're quite tentative, or this is one aspect of the practice. It's a sort of an end result of that is that you are less latched onto your idea that you want it to be this way. This is why the basis of emptiness is there, because you're coming in and you're going out and you're coming in. So it's a dance. It's not formulaic, and it's not, well, I'll do that if you do this. So it's not, well, that's what you meant by arbitration. It's not negotiated. It happens, it's the natural efflorescence of that sort of relationship. It happens in that way.
What's the difference between that sort of thing and a codependence or martyrdom sort of situation?
What's the second word?
Martyrdom.
Oh, martyrdom.
Making oneself a martyr. By, in other words, constantly prioritizing the other person in a certain way that...
Well, I think that what we have to look at here again is that in terms of this being a Vajrayana teaching, those things just simply don't apply. They apply in everyday life, but this is not really ever considered to be a practice for the average human being, although there are things that the average human being could learn from it, but these are dangers for the non-practitioner. Practitioners aren't martyrs, or if they are, they're not practitioners. Not that there couldn't be a practitioner like a Mahasiddha who was deliberately a martyr. That works. I read some Sufi story once about the man who had the teacher with the harridan of a wife, and so he thought he'd do the same and marry some harridan, and ended up saying, well, what made you think you could do this? It was quite an interesting story, that you can't emulate it. But apart from that, one can't really look at those things that happen because one's practicing this equally. One is practicing it from the position of having a teacher. Although one's partner is one's teacher, one also has a teacher who would observe the situation. I think the desire for martyrdom would be undermined by all kinds of practice anyway. So that would really only come into it if one wasn't a practitioner.
So this isn't a sort of relationship advice, the ideal way to have a relationship, sort of Buddhist style.
No, definitely not. Both partners have to be practicing. It's not something you could take on as an individual in a couple.
I remember some psychotherapists who attended teaching that we gave all this, getting very upset about this material and saying it was dangerous, and whatever. And we had to keep on saying, we did say this is for practitioners. This is not for the average person. The average person could try aspects of it out, and it would be beneficial in many contexts. Except, one thing we'd say is that being a martyr is not a compassionate act, because you're allowing somebody to abuse you,
dominate you,
and that is no good for the person who's abusing. It may be no good for you, but it's no good for the person who's abusing you either, and that is just facilitating a bad mind state in another person. So one would not do that. But
it's not a pop psychology.
No.
That's not to say that you wouldn't see people who have good relationships would be displaying these aspects of behaviour that we've been describing. So it's not that people don't fall into it accidentally, because they do. Vajra romances aren't the only good relationships on the planet.
I would not like to suggest it as a one-size-fits-all. It can't work like that. It has to be mutual, and it has to be understood. it's not actually even reliant on perfect behavior all the time. But one has to have that sense of, I don't want to be the badly behaved person. I want to be the well-behaved person. That's what I actually want. And so when I'm reminded, I will be grateful of that, because that's actually what I want to be, you know. And that's really how one has to be working. That's the only work involved. Otherwise, it's delightful. You know, for practitioners, it should be more delightful than not, apart from external pressures which you know, do whatever they do.
How then, when you work with your students, do you bring someone to that realization of emptiness, or to the place where they might be able to embark on the Vajrayana?
It's mainly Shine. And I mean, it's Shine as a formal practice. As an informal practice, it's their life circumstances and their attitudes and their patterning, whatever that patterning happens to be. Largely when they run into trouble with it. I mean, we don't pick people up on their innocuous patterning, but where it's noxious, we'll remind them of it, and then it's a practice of emptiness, simply letting go of that, or trying to let go of it.
Could you talk a bit about what Shine is, or how one would practice Shine?
Shine is simply sitting in any comfortable position and letting go of thought, of being uninvolved with it. And whenever one catches oneself involved, one simply stops. So it's stopping all the time. I'm involved, I let go. I'm involved again, I let go again. It's extremely boring. I think one has to be prepared for that boredom, and pushing through that, and knowing that the boredom is just one's identity wishing to press itself. You know, I'm not defined here. I've got to think in order to be defined. So that's the main thing, really. As a formal practice, as a practice of everyday life, in terms of there's emptiness all the time about.
Well, it was like emptiness before we met you. Before we got started, we didn't know what you were going to ask us, really. You didn't know what we were going to be like. We didn't know what form it would take, did we? So that was a practice of emptiness for all of us. Well, it wasn't unpleasant, but it was empty, wasn't it?
And so people really have to practice, they have to recognize life as Shine. Shine and Latong. I've stopped being this, I've become that.
How would I, say, practice Shine in that moment, as the train's coming, we're about to meet?
You just allow that to play, just notice. Most of it is noticing. And not trying to make it all right. That's making it into form. It'll be fine.
And there's all sorts of peculiar ways that we make it all right, like we might laugh a lot. And that's what someone might do, a grinagog might do in that situation.
Would that be the sort of thing you might point to if someone was working with you? Their tendency to laugh as a way of...
We've not yet...
you have to be careful.
Most of the grynagogs we know would be too sensitive to bring that up.
We might talk about it, but not in relation to that individual. We might use that as an aspect, just like I did then. It can be many things that we will use to fill that nervousness, that emptiness.
I think grynagog is a word that ought to return to everyday speech, because it defines certain people. And I think if they were even aware there was a word for it. I went shopping this morning. Ha 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 ha. I bought some carrots. Ha ha ha. Once it starts happening, you think, well, there's no humour in this. Why are you laughing? There's one of the Mahasiddhas, in fact, who's the Grinagogue mathematician, which is a fascinating story. But the ones we've come across, we wouldn't bring it up with them.
Because it's too destabilizing.
Mm-hmm.
How did your teachers work with you in those sorts of ways? You're talking about pointing out certain things in life, behaviors and so on.
Oh, Chi'imed Rinpoche is the prime example of this. The way he made me responsible for what I said, so that I stopped saying things to please people. The main story of this is the desktop fan. It was in Holland, and he used to go once a week to a flea market, and he'd buy clothes there for Tibetan refugee children. He'd parcel them up and get them shipped off to India. And he came back with a desktop, with a projector. It was a cheap projector. It didn't work. The bulb didn't work. It was broken in various ways. And knowing that I was a photographer, he said, what do you think of this? Now, I had enough experience of him to say, it's a piece of rubbish, Rinpoche. Yeah? Why you say this? I said, well, it doesn't work. The light doesn't work. It's the carriage it doesn't function. And so I plugged it in. The fan started. I said, well, I guess the fan works. He said, something can be done with this. And I thought, oh, God, he's got me already. I said, I guess you could do something with it. What doing? I said, well, I guess you could take it out and make a desktop fan out of it or something. He said, you can do this? And I thought, oh, God, I've got to say yes. If I say no, he'd say, then why you say this, idiot, So I said, well, I told him it was worthless also. That's an important part of it. I thought I was doing really well. It's rubbish, it's worthless. So I said, well, I'd need to buy some tools. No money spending, you worthless saying. So no money spending. So then I had to make this desktop fan with a bread knife from a piece of mahogany in the garden that was part of some old wardrobe that had been thrown out. I had to cut the plastic cowling with a heated up knife that could go through it, and I got a bit, and I cut out the sort of mahogany base to fit in the bottom. No vise. I had to stand on the wood and carve it with a bread knife, and my hands were bleeding by the end of it, because every time I slipped, I'd wrap my knuckles on the stone. So I eventually carve it out, and I've got a screwdriver, a small screwdriver, and I get screws out of the body of the projector, and I fix the fan in. I put little holes in the back. I put a piece of perforated zinc in the front that I bend round and screw in. I use the little rubber grommet so the cable goes into the little motor inside. And so I give it to him. There it is. It took me a week to make this thing. Horrible. Just hours of toil on this, and it was ugly. It was a vile-looking little thing. So I say, here, Rinpoche. And he looks at it. He plugs it in. It works. Yeah, good. He wraps it up and puts it in the suitcase, and that's it. Yeah, good. That's all the thanks I got for this thing. So I thought, well, I wasn't doing this for thanks anyway, so fine. So that's the first part of the story. Some years later, I meet a rather unpleasant individual in Dharamsala, Upper Dharamsala. he was the kind of individual who'd be friendly when he was poor. And he was in want of a meal, and so I thought, well, let's be a Buddhist about this and take him out for a meal. I can do that. I needn't hold grudges, need I? No, not me. So we go out for a meal, and I say, so I knew he'd spent time with Chi'imed Rinpoche. I won't mention his name. And apparently Chi'imed Rinpoche had thrown him out. And I said, so what was it like there? Oh, he said, he has a nice shrine room. He said, but he was always blowing incense into my face with this nasty little fan on his desk. And I said, what was that fan like? He said, a nasty grey little thing with perforated zinc in the front. And I said, oh, right. That's very funny. You know, I didn't say anything about it. And I thought, oh, after all the nasty things this gentleman had done to me over the years, I thought, oh, at least Chi'imed Rinpoche got him back for it. You know, he said he used to be choking on incense, and he'd sort of drive the incense towards him with this fan. About a year later, I ran into Chi'imed Rinpoche again. We were spending time together, and I said, oh, I met such a body, and he was telling me about this fan. He said, yeah, that was so funny. He choking, much choking. And because I told him about this because I wanted to admit my shameful feelings of glee that my little fan had made him choke, you see. But he didn't think that was in any way interesting. He said, oh, much deserving, he said. So that's the whole story. And it went on for almost 6 years from stage to stage of the thing. And he was always working with me in that way that he'd seen that I had an apron that I'd made for myself with pockets in it. And he said, you like this one making? And I said, yes, Rinpoche, sure, I'll make one like that for you. He said, but big pocket, you know. I said, you mean gussets in it, you know, to make them stand out? Oh, yes, good. So he said, and also at the back, front and back, and pockets, front and back, big, long pockets. I said, yeah, well, how long are the pockets? He said, this long. So there was this strange thing I made him, and he called it the kangaroo. And he said, you having this done in July? And I said, I can't do that, Rinpoche. I said, I can have it ready in August, but not July. And so he really pressured me for getting it in August. And I thought, no, this time I'm standing my ground. I said, I can try, Rinpoche, but I cannot promise. Because I keep my promises, and I cannot promise I can try. And so he tried anyway to get a promise out of me. And this time I said, no, I can't promise because I don't want to break my promise. I will try, can't promise. So I eventually finished it in July, posted it to him and said, promised in order in August, delivered in July. And he never did that to me again after that. So it was really quite funny. He just wanted me to stand my ground. And what I was saying had to be reasonable, that I could not finish it, in my opinion, in July. That I was not willing to make that a promise. Even though I tried, I couldn't put a promise on it. And he was always getting me to do that, so that what I said, you had to count on what I said, and I had to know what I was saying, etc. So many times he did that to me before I learned the lesson.
Which was?
That I shouldn't try to please people with what I said, and that I should say what I mean and mean what I say. And so that was extremely helpful. You know, that, the other one was when his biggest insult to me was, you one big diplomat. This was in Geneva, I think. Yeah, Geneva. There was a man there there was a wealthy fellow who'd invented sophrology. which was a combination of philosophy and theology, or something of that nature. And he was having a discussion with Chi'imed Rinpoche. He loved to come there and talk to him, and about the fact that plants are sentient. And there was this argument going on, and he was saying, well, plants are sentient because if you get one plant and you do this, the other plant reacts. And then Chi'imed Rinpoche said, well, you do this to a machine and it reacts. What's the difference? And this was his argument. And so he said, Ngakpa Chögyam, what are you saying? And I said, well, I don't know, Rinpoche. I said, oh, you one big diplomat. He said, you tantric man, you must be knowing. So I said, all right then. I said, I'd say they have sentience. He said, why saying? And I said, well, as you said, a machine will respond if you do this, but machines were created to do that. As I'm a tantric man, I don't believe in God. So if there's no God to design them to do that, that means they're sentient. You have to believe in God for plants not to be sentient. If they respond, they're not designed. And so the master of sophrology said, so, what do you say now? And Chi'imed Rinpoche just burst out laughing, and that was the end of it. But it was, he liked to put me on the spot. That I was supposed to help him teach in Frankfurt, because the woman there was worried about his English, because his English is not easy to understand. When I repeat things he says, I usually talk like Yoda, because that's how Tibetans speak, verb at the end. Verb always at the end coming. So he was giving some teaching on Tonglen, and he said, now you something, say, for an hour. So I launched in immediately and started covering some aspect of what he was teaching. Wound it up in a way that I thought was fairly neat and concise at the end, and stopped. He said, still 5 minutes coming. So in addition to just had to launch in for 5 minutes, and I knew it could only be 5 minutes, and I had to say something intelligent and useful in 5 minutes when I'd already concluded, and he'd do that too. And so that was really valuable, uncomfortable, but incredibly valuable. Crazy wisdom is Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche's word. It's his coinage. I've always used it up to recently. Now we use the Tibetan Yeshe Cholwa, because crazy wisdom is not a translation. It's not a literal translation. Yeshe is primordial wisdom. Ye, primordial, she, knowing. Cholwa means chaos. So there's no crazy in that. So it basically means wisdom chaos, or primordial wisdom chaos. The aspect of chaos is that which offends pattern. It offends the pattern of duality, even the religious pattern of duality. So hence crazy wisdom, or Yeshe Cholwa. Now, there's an area of confusion that has arisen even with Tibetan Lamas as to the nature of two particular modes of unconventional behavior. One is called Yeshe Cholwa, which is connected with Dzogchen. The other one is Myunharuka, which Myon is actually crazy. That's the word, and Haruka or Traktung is blood drinker. Traktung is the word used, or Haruka, about wrathful awareness beings. Now, Myon Haruka is shocking. It's different from Yeshe Cholwa. It's shocking because it turns things upside down. And it has a great deal in connection with overcoming the pure-impure dichotomy. So there's a lot of snake and scorpion eating goes on. The 5 meats, the 5 nectars, taking those as actual, perhaps. So there's excrement, pus, urine, feces, whatever. The 5 meats, horse, etc., pig, human meat. These are things that could be eaten. Mostly it's symbolic, but lamas such as Drukpa Kunley would be Myon Haruka. They would act outrageously. They would overturn social mores. This is very much Myon Haruka. This is different from Yeshe Cholwa. Yeshe Cholwa does not set out to shock. It may shock, but it has no intention of shocking. I would say it's more akin to some kind of Vajra whimsy. That the person simply does not accord with formula in any way. Now that need not be shocking. I might, fortunately I'm not a crazy wisdom master, or I might pass you an envelope stuffed with £50 notes and say, oh, you can have that. That might be shocking, but it might be pleasurable also. So Yeshe Cholwa is really something that is, you can't really explain what it is as you can explain what Myon Haruka is. That's quite easy to explain. You can look at lamas such as Drukpa Kunley. You can look at Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche as well and say they conform to that model. But Yeshe Cholwa does not conform to any model at all. And I think particularly it has nothing to do with predictable behavior. So sexually abusing students is not Yeshe Cholwa, primarily because it's predictable. That people in positions of power who abuse positions of power, what they do is predictable. Now, how is this crazy? This is highly predictable. Financial abuse is highly predictable. So if it's predictable, it's not Yeshe Cholwa. Yeshe Cholwa has to be unpredictable. I always remember Chi'imed Rinpoche in the middle of a Bardo Turdol empowerment with his bell and damaru, he's chanting, and he suddenly sniffs his armpit and says, somebody once told me I smell. Do you think I smell? And then he just continued. I was sitting there and I thought, did I just drift off and have a daydream there, or did that actually happen? So I turned to the gentleman next to me. I said, did you? He said, yeah, yes. He'd never done it before. He never did it afterwards. So it wasn't a habit of his to do that. So I always used to describe him as unpredictably unpredictable. He would just come out of left field. Excuse the Americanism, but he would do things that were just, you just didn't understand them at all. And they weren't particularly shocking, they were just strange, completely. What was that question he once asked you about women, about orgasms?
Oh, yes. That was, I think it was when you were introducing me to him. But as your girlfriend. I think I'd met him before, but we're now in a different relationship. And he said to me, do women ejaculate? Do you think women ejaculate? And obviously it was a complete emptiness experience. He hadn't said anything else to me. In fact, I don't think he'd ever said anything personally to me before that anyway. So I said, yes, I think they do. And then we just passed into normal conversation after that.
I'd never heard him ever ask anyone a question like that before. It was extraordinary. And then there was a gentleman once who was dying of cancer, and there was this was outrageous. There was a whole discussion going on as to whether he was going to die. And some people thought he was going to die, others didn't, and then...
And this was at a public teaching.
A public teaching. And then he said, I say Ajita does not die. And then he asked me what I thought, and I said, well, Ajita can't die, because Ajita means deathless, you see. So he was just making a joke. The whole thing was a joke, but I don't think anyone understood it. They just found it bewildering. But the interesting thing was that Ajita himself understood the joke. And so it was basically for him, and the only way I could understand it in the end was that it was a deeply touching and intimate joke, that it was something to make him smile, that it was a play with his name, and that's what it was all about. But,
and I had to take that as sort of a personal teaching to me, because at the time I was a hospice care nurse. And I mean, obviously well aware of the fact that you have these conversations about dying and death, and that they should be there, but not in a public setting, not like that. And I remember talking to you on the train on the way home, saying, "You can't do things like that." But that was just my set ideas of how things, or it was my perception of the event. I wasn't perceiving it as a personal thing between them.
Yeah, you could see him. I could see him smiling at the back, because he knew it was a joke, and that he didn't have much time left to find anything funny. But so that was he appreciated the humour of it.
Yeah. And it was also an example of how he did want people to speak their minds, because he asked you, didn't he, what you thought, and you said that he can't die, and then he asked me, and I knew he was going to die, and I knew I should have said he's going to die, but I didn't, because I couldn't, because it was public, and it was one of those situations I just wanted to cringe and die. So I said, same like him. So complete cop-out.
The next thing, I'm in London, I go to see Chi'imed Rinpoche, and I said, well, I think I ought to tell you that, Déchen and I are getting together, but just to let you know, but we're not telling anybody at the moment. It's a secret. It's only you know this. Right? By the time I get to Cardiff, everybody in Cardiff knows. It took that long for him to just broadcast it. So we're sort of used to him doing things like this. And why it was particularly that he didn't want us having a secret, I have no idea. I never asked him, but it was very funny when we found out, and it was somewhat of a relief too, because we thought, well, that's just what's happening. So yes, Crazy Wisdom. He sort of veered between Myon Haruka and Yeshe Cholwa in his manifestations. It's not that you have to book on to use one or the other, but those are the two modes, and they get confused with each other. And one Lama who understands this is Tulku Drukpa Rinpoche, and he in fact told Bacha, one of our students, that not many people understand this differentiation, and that most people think of it as Myon Haruka, the shocking behaviour. But yet neither are called Crazy Wisdom. That's sort of a split between them. The crazy belongs to the Myon Haruka, not to the Yeshe Cholwa, the Dzogchen mode. That's simply primordial wisdom chaos. And the chaos is not that you create chaos, but simply that it doesn't accord to any pattern. It doesn't accord to a religious pattern either. So it doesn't accord to renunciation, that one doesn't necessarily look like a renunciate, because that's as much of a fashion as anything else.
What's the effect over time of being exposed to that sort of a person?
Well, it was only for relatively short periods with Chi'imed Rinpoche. It's hard to say, really. When you're involved with something to such a degree that it's your entire life, then it's simply the experience you're having. I wouldn't know what somebody else's experience was. I think it would depend why you were doing it. I mean, I think that I actively wanted him to mess with me. I think if you're messed with, and it's something that you don't want or haven't agreed to in yourself, it's another thing. The reason I decided to ask him to be my teacher for a period of time, because Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche had told me there'll be a period where we won't see each other for 12 or 13 years. And in that time, you should study with, he gave me a list of different lamas, and Chi'imed Rinpoche was one of them. He also mentioned Chagdud Tulku and a few other lamas, but I just so happened that I'd already met Chi'imed Rinpoche, and I thought, yes, I'd like to study with him. And the reason was because we entertained him to dinner. Khandro, Déchen and I weren't together at that particular point. This was earlier. And I got in a Chinese meal, and a nice Chinese meal for him and his daughter. And I also got in some cheese, because I know he likes cheese. And I part of it, I got Stilton, and I got an entire round of brie, about this large, about that thick, because I thought, however much anyone likes brie, there'll be some for me. So after lunch, Chi'imed Rinpoche cut himself off a little piece of brie, ate the brie and said, "This is very good." He then picked up the whole round and ate it, all of it. And it was then that I thought, oh, you really are going to mess with me, aren't you? You're obviously the ideal teacher. So it didn't stop there, though. Then we went on to the place in Bristol where he wanted me to take my slides and give a slideshow. And then he'd comment on the slides. And he got them to melt down the Stilton that I'd bought as well. So they melted it, and he asked me to go out and buy chilies. So I bought a big bag of chilies, and he was dipping them into this Stilton and eating these raw chilies. And he said, "You trying?" I said, "I'd rather not, Rinpoche." I said, "They have a really bad effect on me." He said, no, these very sweet." So I said, "You want me to eat one?" I said, "Right." I dipped it in the Stilton. And actually, he was right. I crunched into it, and it was sweet for a minute second, and then it exploded in my mouth. And, oh, God, he laughed. He also got me a pint of milk immediately and told me to hold it in my mouth, and that would cure it. But I thought, this is going to be fun. He's going to do stuff. But somehow I decided I was up for that. I'd read the stories, I'd read about Mahasiddhas, I'd read this stuff, so sure. Now, I don't think I was up for being abused, but I didn't count that as abuse. It didn't feel like abuse, because he got me the milk and he was concerned about me, and he was also extremely kind to me. He answered my questions. He was very supportive. It was a mixed bag, because he gave me his pair of sunglasses, which were incredibly expensive things. These Tibetan glasses. they're made out of smoky quartz. They're basically like this, you know. It's a little bit thicker, of course, but they're actually polished quartz crystal. And in Tibet, apparently Vajra Rinpoche had to pay 2 horses for a pair of these glasses, and he just gave them to me. So he was like that, as well as getting me to eat raw chili and eating an entire round of brie. So there was just these mixtures of experiences with him. So it was always highly creative and a sense of the whole situation was being tested in a way, and worked with and encouraged in different ways. Sometimes it was a wrathful form of encouragement, sometimes joyous, sometimes peaceful. So, you know, the effect on me was that I'd actually say I just grew up, you know. I think a lot of us remain as children for a long time, and not in any nice, innocent way, just not capable of living properly, you know, not being responsible, not being... I mean, his advice on going to India when people gave him advice was not how to find the cheapest hotel and make sure you're all right. It was, you just land, go into the first hotel, whatever it costs, spend your money, then it's gone, see what happens next. It was always throw yourself at life and see what happens. But you really had to be some kind of professional human being to do that. It was an adventure, and he wasn't really interested in anything being cozy. So if you wanted to be cozy, you went somewhere else, but he never did that.
You mentioned Drukpa Kunley.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a bit about him?
Yeah, Drukpa Kunley was very famous in Bhutan and much loved in Bhutan. And one of the things you find in Bhutan that you don't find in Tibet are symbols of Drukpa Kunley. There are penises everywhere, hanging over doors, brightly coloured ones with faces on them. They're just part of life over there, and he's highly venerated. And this, of course, is, you know, shocking behaviour. You know, I think that sex with Drukpa Kunley is a little bit like Chi'imed Rinpoche eating the brie. I don't think there's any big difference there. I mean, we live in a society where sex is a big issue. It wasn't a big issue there. You know, it's entirely different. It has a whole other meaning here. I mean, sexual exploitation wasn't really an issue then. I mean, sexuality occurred, but it wasn't an issue. It's an issue now. There's certainly abuse now. There's abuse of power, but, you know, Drukpa Kunley didn't have hundreds of students. He didn't have a procurement committee. That's not how it worked. He just wandered around and bumped into people, and things occurred. Like Chi'imed Rinpoche came to my house and ate an entire round of brie. I see it as being the same story. You know, and what comes out of that extraordinary behavior is a sense of being projected into a different dimension of reality, where these things occur. These things here are normal. And relating to them as it's all part of what's happening is maybe similar in some ways to being at the theatre, and you don't know the play. You don't know what's going to happen. Actually, the funniest play I ever saw was just like that. It was The Real Inspector Hound, that was Tom Stoppard play that was put on at the art school where I was, and I was in the audience, and they were performing it, and the stage gun didn't go off. And so the man who was being shot, when the gun didn't do anything, said, "Ah, the poisoned dart," and fell to the floor. And because I'd seen, I knew the story, it was just so funny, and I thought they should write to Tom Stoppard, because this would have improved the play endlessly. It was just brilliant, and so there's a sort of a world there. There's a Vajra creation, Vajra theatrics are occurring. And within Vajrayana, which is majorly artistic, there are just scenarios. And so Drukpa Kunley would enter various scenarios, and they weren't all sexual, they were different. He would get some old man to chant some really crazy text that he'd just written that was... But what got the old man realization wasn't the text, it was his devotion to Drukpa Kunley and the fact that he would simply recite a bunch of nonsense for hours on end. And he'd recite it even though his son and daughter were saying, what on earth is this text you're chanting? This is crazy. Well, he just wouldn't believe it. He just continued. And so that's the power of the story there. Of course, doing whatever your teacher tells you to do in this environment it has become suspect, And I think people have to use their intelligence there and look at what the nature of the relationship is. I mean, there was never one instance where either Chi'imed Rinpoche or Khandro Rinpoche acted out of self-interest. They never got anything out of it. Well, Chi'imed Rinpoche did get the entire round of brie, but it didn't break the bank. I didn't suffer because of it. He probably suffered more through eating it than I did through losing it. But so it's really that Drukpa Kunley had no self-interest. There's one story about him where he's offered all this jewelry, a fantastic wealth of jewelry, and he puts it all on. He accepts it. He dances with it, then he gives it all back again and leaves. He said, I enjoyed it. And that was it. So he didn't take that offering of money. So there has to be demonstrable lack of self-interest in it. And that comes out in the stories of Drukpa Kunley. People are confused because, of course, they look at someone like Sogyal Lakar and say, what's the difference? The difference is that the ladies with whom Drukpa Kunley had sex didn't end up with a therapist. They achieved realization. That's the difference. And nobody had a complaint to make about him. I mean, I know it's very hard to compare somebody long in the past with someone in the present, and there are all those considerations. I think one of the differences is cultural, in as much as if you lived in Tibet or if you lived in India, there was some expectation that there would be people like this. So it wasn't entirely surprising, and you could either go along with it or not. I think one of the problems now is that there's a similarity between rock music culture and Tibetan Lamas, and Tibetan Lamas can, if they want, manifest that groupie scene. Now, the difference is that groupies are not expecting anything. Groupies are not expecting to be on the next album. They know what's going on. They know why they're there. They're not expecting anything they get or don't get. It's just what happens. Now, in the whole Vajrayana situation, there is an expectation. I'm going to get realization out of this or something. And then when that doesn't happen, and in fact worse happens, and physical abuse occurs, then there's incredible confusion that goes on there. I think basically there's a... what's it called? Math? I'm not good at math. An equation between how weird it gets and what the good result is. So the more extraordinary the behavior of the teacher, the more extraordinary the realization has to be. It's concomitant. If that's not there, then one has to question what's happening. So all you can do really is look at the stories of Drukpa Kunley. You can't go and interview the people. You've only got the story. And what the story relates is that these people attained realization. Now, whether that was a big clean-up that occurred later or not, who knows? But no one's going to know anyway. You've only got the story. And the story in itself has to be taken as a teaching that extraordinary behavior, extraordinary result. That's what's in the story. That's the only bit that we can use, really. And if there's extraordinary behavior and misery, then this is not the Drukpa Kunley story. I think that's all that can be taken out of it.
It's not a method story. It says do this and good things will happen.
Yeah.